Now, in the previous video, we saw that Israel had been returned to a status of a landless, stateless, really a refugee people group, almost like they had been over 1,000 years earlier in slavery in Egypt. Well, does that mean that God's promise to restore relationship with humanity through Israel was impossible? Did the gospel die along with national Israel? You'll find the answer to this sixth context, in this sixth context of the 10 contexts of biblical Israel, Israel in exile. Only one more and then we're done with the Old Testament, but don't miss this one. The exilic period has some very powerfully deep theology, some doctrine. And it's what that is just the reasonable implications, the worldview implications from the facts of what God said and did. Let's get into it. It's really crazy. This is our timeline, which we've been walking through. We've walked through over 1,000 years of history and literature of Israel. Because at the end of it, we want to sit down, have a cup of coffee with Jesus, and be able to have an informed conversation, to know his history, to know his culture, and to get to know him better in his true context. Now listen, you should be able to write this timeline out for yourself by the time we're done. So here's more review to get you ready for coffee with Jesus. In the first video, we talked about before Israel, why did the nations need the gospel that Israel was to bring? In the second video, we talked about how tribal Israel had the chance to prove to the world that God's fatherhood and kingship obviated the need for coercive government. Isn't that interesting? Big use of words. All that means is when God's king, we treat each other properly. Tribal rejected this and failed. The monarchy had another chance. And in fact, God proved himself faithful and blessed them. And they had all the wealth. They had all the reputation. They had the land. They had the best of all things. But God wanted their hearts. And Solomon fell. And fell into idolatry and injustice. And we see the history of the divided monarchy. And then after the exile of the 10 tribes, Judah alone was really living out the consequences of idolatry and injustice in Israel. And finally, the nation died. And that brings us to this last section, the exile context, number 6 out of the 10 contexts of the Bible, the exile. So here's the section, the discussion on Israel. You can take a screen grab for discussion later. Here's the question I'm asking. How would your religion look? How would your religious worldview or your opinion have been affected if your own people, the people of God, as you call yourselves, were exiled, scattered throughout an unbelieving empire? How would that affect your belief in God? That's what you should ask yourself as you study the books in this section. Pretend you're in exile. You may be asking, well, what about God's promises to Israel? And it's a legitimate question. Read Ezekiel, the first half of Ezekiel, and you'll see the elders were asking these questions. What about the covenants? And this is a representation of the 5 covenants of Israel. You'll see the last 3 are specific to Israel. Abraham and the land and the family. Well, now they have no land, and they really have no family in the promised land. What about the Mosaic covenant? They have no temple. They have no sacrifices. There's no Ark of the Covenant. What about the Davidic covenant? There's no king. There's no throne. There's no capital. There's no sovereignty. How can God prove himself faithful to his people without those things? Well, I think God has a very clear answer. he says, well, what about Israel's obedience? And the book of Kings is exactly this conversation. The book of Kings says God is just to judge and walks right through the history, showing the prophetic warnings, showing the king's rejection of God, pursuit of idolatry, and the resultant injustice, and walks through their entire history, proving this point. God is just because Israel is disobedient. Well, has he broken his covenant promises to bless them? No. He actually proved his faithfulness to curse even his own people, his chosen nation, just as he had promised. Read it. It's in Deuteronomy 28. And in Leviticus 26, he says, I'm going to bless you if you follow me, and I'm going to curse you if you don't. So really, God did prove himself faithful. But he goes beyond that. It's really miraculous. He needs no land. He needs no temple. He needs no human king. He proves he was still powerful and faithful to bless those who are themselves faithful. Even after exile, he walked with Jeremiah. He spoke to the prophet Obadiah. Even in refugee communities where the Israelites had nothing, God showed up personally to Ezekiel. God spoke powerfully and accurately through Ezekiel and proved himself present, connected, and positive, actually. The last half of Ezekiel is beautiful imagery of how God promised to prove faithful to all of his covenants, to complete everything, because he loves his people. And even in the capital of Babylon itself, Daniel, just one guy with a couple of his college buddies, fighting the man, standing up for God in the most powerful, corrupt system on earth. And God proved himself present and faithful in the life of Daniel. This is an amazing time period. It's a lot like the church. The church doesn't need one particular land. We don't need a physical temple. Even Jesus decided not to physically be here on earth. He decided he would have his spirit in us. And yet we are supposed to be faithful and believe that all of his covenants will be fulfilled. So take the time, identify with these people in exile. God is really refining their faith. He took away all those things that they turned into idols, their possessions, their safety, right? Their land and their government, all of their identity. He stripped that all away, and he's digging deep into the realities, the truth of their faith, and refining that while they're in exile. Make the effort. Get your faith refined. Find Jesus in the exile. And man, you're going to learn a lot. Well, politics was very important, international politics, even during this time. And we find out archaeologically that Babylon quickly became the wealthiest and most powerful world empire yet. And yet, within 50 years, Babylon was conquered by the Persians in 539. It's the Medo-Persians. It was an alliance between the Median Empire and the Persian Empire. And King Cyrus was the man. In 538, Persian Emperor Cyrus decreed that the Israelites could return to their land of Israel and rebuild their temple, and gave them a ton of money to do it. We know this from Ezra, the first chapter of Ezra. We don't have archaeological evidence specifically about Israel and this decree, but we do have something called the Cyrus Cylinder, which has language about other nations which Cyrus authorized to return and build temples in their homeland. And we saw this in London. It's in the British Museum. Pretty awesome. Well, it turns out only 1% of the Israelites returned to Israel. The rest stayed scattered throughout the world. So 99% were scattered throughout the nations. 1% came back, and in the first chapter of Ezra, we find out this 1% was filled with the Spirit. In other words, they were pumped. God set them apart, got them ready, and they made the trip back to the promised land. So there were Israelites back in Israel. They didn't own it. They had money to build a temple, but it was a temple designed by the Persians, actually, with Persian money. And they didn't have a king. They still served the Persian kings. Later, there were some other returns with Ezra and Nehemiah, and they took a different route. Still, only a tiny, tiny percentage of Israel had returned to the land. So let's look at this time period in the books. During the exile, there was these amazing books and amazing prophets, and in fact, God proved himself faithful by bringing them back from the dead. Think deeply about what this says about God. That God brought them back from the dead. He proved himself faithful through judgment. Listen to the doubters and find out what the doubters think about God. Ezekiel and Daniel knew God is more powerful and his promises never fail, including his power to curse. The doubters thought, well, let's just not serve God. In other words, they didn't think God was sovereign. How does it change your view about humanity? God was fully present, and he didn't need to have one particular location on earth. Fully present with all the peoples on earth, fully active in the minds of Nebuchadnezzar. God was reading Nebuchadnezzar's mail. God is no respecter of persons, including Israel. There's some deep theology that comes from understanding the exile and these books. I love them. I love to teach exilic books because it really challenges us today and our walk in Jesus' kingdom. You know, it's a party. Israel's coming back. And it's really miraculous because you know Jesus. And Jesus himself is the only human who ever was resurrected by Father from the dead. He resurrected himself, so to speak. Well, guess what? Now you know Israel was also raised from the dead. Now that you know their history and their teachings, you know that God raises a whole nation from the dead. I think that this amazing return to Israel was pointing Israel's faith forward to Jesus' victory over death. It's the fulfillment of the Adamic covenant, right? Not just Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic. It's bigger. It's Noahic. God's going to save the earth. And the Adamic covenant, which is even greatest, God is going to defeat death itself. It's a powerful period of time. Study Daniel's life. Daniel was fully engaged in actively transforming this godless Babylon. It wasn't godless. God was there, and he was active in Daniel's life, and that's our job today. We're supposed to be involved in the world, in everything that God is doing out there. God will prove himself present. He doesn't need any of these physical things because he's got you, and he's got you on location, and the Holy Spirit's ready to rock. I hope you believe that's true. If not, come to YWAM and we'll teach you. God bless you as you study the books of the exile.